When discussing the meaning crisis, myself and others have identified lack of community as one of its primary causes. Therefore, one of the main missions on my channel has been to theorize about and build community. But whenever this topic comes up, there are always several people in my comments that say it's unnecessary, claiming that they are already in communities. After all, they tell me, I have a partner and a few friends, and I know plenty of people in my classes, and I go to kickboxing practice, and I'm in a few Discord servers, and I'm a member of the fandom I love. I have community, right? Wrong. Those things I just mentioned aren't communities. They are, at best, groups. Because the word community means something more than just a group of people who have some surface level qualities in common. But a lot of people seem not to understand this, as when trying to define community, instead of describing their underlying structure, they'll just list a series of features which communities might have, like shibboleths or rituals. They'll make claims like that, for example, that Smash Bros. Melee fandom must be a community because they have shibboleths. They call 1v1 matches friendlies instead of practice matches. But like, saying that communities have shibboleths, the Melee fandom had shibboleths, therefore the Melee fandom must be a community, is equally as wrong as saying that chemotherapy can make you lose hair, razors can make you lose hair, therefore razors must be a form of chemotherapy. It's putting the cart before the horse and fundamentally misunderstanding what communities are. And I think this lack of understanding is seriously hurting us. And so in this video, I'm going to do my best to define what I feel makes a community, and prescribe some methods that we might want to use when bolstering community in our lives. So let's get started. A community at its core needs two things. Number one, a structure of people, and number two, a set of intrinsic transcendent values. Part 1. What the hell is an intrinsic transcendent value? So let's break that down bit by bit. Values should be pretty obvious. If a community is organized around nothing more than proximity, then by definition, as soon as that proximity ends, like at the end of a semester, then the community will disappear. Communities are sustained by a massive amount of effort. You are going to require people to give up money and time and effort and freedom. But not only does there need to be value, that value needs to be intrinsic. Because you can motivate people to organize a community extrinsically by, say, paying them, but at that point that's not a community, that's just a business. You could also try to reward people extrinsically by giving them, say, social status within the community. But if that's all you have to offer, then quickly you're gonna end up with an ugly panopticon, a series of crabs in buckets, pulling each other down so they can get a better place in the hierarchy. So these two steps are pretty easy to understand. A group of, say, musicians all have in common that they intrinsically value music. But there's still one piece of the puzzle missing, and that's that value has to be transcendent. Now, I use the word transcendent a lot on my YouTube channel, and every time I do so, I'm very careful to define it. A value is transcendent to you if and only if it exists outside of the usual paradigm you use to determine value. For a quick example, take like Iron Man. At the beginning of the movie, he is making his money from being an arms dealer, which hurts people, which changes him as a person and completes his pathway through the hero's journey. If you've ever heard Jordan Peterson's idea of what's at the bottom of your hierarchy, or Joseph Campbell's idea of finding your bliss, my idea of transcendence is exactly the same thing as what they're talking about. I just use slightly different language for it. So now that we understand what transcendence is, we can answer why is it necessary to be part of the value system of a community. And simply put, the answer is that humans suck. We are messy, we are selfish, we put each other down to look better, we'll have natural differences which will create conflicts. And so if you all intrinsically value something non-transcendent like music, then eventually a bunch of musicians might have an argument which will collapse the community. But if you have a value that's transcendent, like say your love for Jesus, then suddenly everyone in the room has something that they care about more than whatever petty squabble they're going through. Day to day, there will always be conflict which threatens your community to collapse, and so just tautologically, the only way to beat that is to have something which you always care about more than a conflict. Now, I mentioned that something religious like a love for Jesus can be that transcendent value, but it can also be something like art. Now, in the beginning of this video, I did slag off fandoms a bit because ultimately your enjoyment of a franchise is rarely going to be transcendent, but it is at least possible for fandoms to bridge that gap. A group like, say, the K-pop fandom only care about that piece of art because it can give them some dopamine, but a group like, say, the Tolkien Society engage with that piece of art because it means something deeper to them. Tolkien is their connection to an ancient English mythology which never existed. It's the means through which they explore their queer identity. It's the stories of heroism which they've carried with them connected them to previous generations and inspired them throughout their entire life. Or in other words, sometimes if you care about a hobby enough and really attach it to your identity, your love for it can slowly become transcendent. Which means, despite what I said at the beginning, yeah, in some rare cases, bands or fandoms can validly become communities. But of course there is a limit to this, as if you only have a small community, then you might be able to care about something as specific as like your local art scene. But if you want to expand a community to include like all of society, then you need to change your value to something generalizable enough that billions of people can care about it. Something as wide-spanning as like liberalism or Western society. But if you want to expand that community even further, say across time, and have something that people living in 100 and 2000 AD can both agree upon, then you're going to need to make that value even more inspecific, to the point where what you're worshipping is nothing more than the intrinsic nature of goodness, or in other words, God. Which is why thus far in all of human civilizations, religions have been the only structures which have successfully been able to survive across time. The Potters Guild didn't survive the Roman Empire. Christianity did. And so now that we have that base understanding of values out the way, we can get onto some specifics and talk about the structures of communities. Communities require 4 fundamental pillars of their structure, each one informed by their transcendent values. In biology, in order for something to be defined as an organism, it needs to fit 2 criteria. Number 1, a cell wall, which selectively allows only some substances inside of it, and number 2, reproduction. And I think we can transfer this concept onto communities. Communities require some sort of selection process, some sort of gatekeeping, which determines who is and isn't a member. Now, some communities have to have very thick cell walls. The Navy SEALs, for example, can only be joined if you go through a grueling year-long process of recruitment. Meanwhile, groups like, say, Alcohol Anonymous work best with a very thin cell wall. Their only requirement for joining is that you have a sincere desire to lower your alcohol consumption. The second thing that intrinsic transcendent values allow you to have is a Dao, which means path. I've rendered it in Chinese because I'm pretentious. Simply put, if there is a value which you care about more than anything, then there must be something to be done about that value. If you genuinely believe that Jesus died for our sins, then surely you're going to want to congregate with other people who believe the same and go on missionary work. But you can't have people just throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what fits. You need a defined path for them to follow to fulfill this. You need, on the soft end, a community to emerge to socially police people to make sure they're doing the right thing. And on the hard end, rules and teaching and curriculums and stipends and enforcement to make sure people know how to do the right thing. Is it the case that Christians should A, give to charity, or B, commit genocides? Unless the value system exists within a context of interpretation which allows you to answer this question, the value system is essentially worthless. So how do you stay close to this path? Well, the answer is rituals. I mentioned rituals and cultures and shibboleths at the beginning of this video, but I hope it's clear why I've waited so long to talk about them properly. Because while these rituals are important, you can't get too hung up on them, and they can only exist if they are the end result, the symptom of the value system, cell wall, and Dao that I talked about before. Rituals on their own are worthless. My city has a big wall on it that sometimes they do projector light art shows, and as a ritual, many people in my city go to watch it, but we're not connected when we do this. Right after COVID happened, everybody started calling it the virus without clarifying which virus they meant because it was obvious through context. But like, did you feel connected to people when you used this language, or did it just emerge through necessity? Here I have given you 2 examples of common rituals and language, but because these examples didn't come out of a community, they weren't worth anything to you. But if they do come out of a community, if you're part of a poetry group and every week you get together and listen to each other's art, is meaningful to you and does count as a ritual. I'll also mention that while we're on this topic, rituals cannot be created by a single person. They have to emerge naturally. Rituals aren't what communities are, but they are the point of contact through which you interact with communities. They are the extrinsic worldly value that you enjoy in the moment every day that connect you to your transcendent value. They're the point where the world and the transcendent touch. But of course, if you're having rituals, they need to be organized by someone, and that's why the final thing a community needs in its structure is leadership. And this is probably the most self-explanatory one. At the end of every decision or disagreement, you're gonna need somebody who gets the final say. Now, something I want to point out is that these features I've mentioned are in an order, and this order can't be done any other way round. Leadership will be ripe for abuse unless they've gone through the rituals proving themselves worthy. You can't have rituals unless you have a DAO that they are defined around. You can't have a DAO unless there is some sort of cell wall defining what a community is about, and that cell wall has to be defined by its transcendent values. Trying to speedrun this process by jumping to the end will always end in disaster. If you just start with leadership and have a person organizing a group of people with no checks on their power, that's just a cult. If you want to demand that everyone follow the same rituals that you do despite not being on the same path as you, that's nothing more than closed-minded social pressure. If you want to have a path for people to follow without first working out your value system, you end up with like Andrew Tate, in which you have a bunch of people saying they want to become better and go on this journey, but with no underlying virtue philosophy keeping them good. And of course, if you want to have a cell wall, gatekeeping defined around anything other than values, that is the definition of bigotry. And so at the end of the day, if you want to have community, the number one thing you need is this: transcendent intrinsic values. But as you already know, because this isn't an original hot take, our ability to abide by transcendent values has faded in society. Gott ist tet, Gott bleibt tet, and we have killed him. With the death of our value system, the dominoes were set up and community was the second victim. And so now you have a bunch of people scooping bathwater into the bath despite the fact that the baby is halfway across the room and drowning themselves. Inventing harmful subcultures with restrictive shibboleths, desperate for the feeling they think community is supposed to give them. And so do you want to know how to make community? Just believe in something. Find people who do the same, and then organize with them.